Well, look, just changing things a little, there's a story in today's Sydney Daily Telegraph about a Liberal MP for the state seat of Oakley, Mark Courret. He's been in the New South Wales Parliament since 2011. He makes the headlines today because the company of a businessman linked to the Chinese Communist Party was used by Mark Courret to print taxpayer-funded electorate material. As well, the party received a donation of $1,000. There's talk of his association with a fellow called Yang Dong Dong, who's described himself as part of the United Front system. The story then adds that Mr Courret was a VIP guest at a Chinese community Christmas function last year, attended by Mr Yang. Now, look, this is a minefield for politicians. They attend function after function. Every second person wants their picture taken with them, and it's impossible for a politician to know the background of every person with whom they're identified. I don't know whether this MP, Mark Courret, knows anything about this United Front mob. There is a tendency to want to condemn everything Chinese at the moment, and yet China is an important component of our economic well-being. We have to separate the Chinese people from the Chinese leadership, which I could best describe as being antediluvian, which means, I might add, ridiculously old-fashioned. Xi has taken China back 50 years. One day, hopefully, the 1.4 billion Chinese people will assert themselves and rise up in the name of democracy, but that's another story. Catherine McGregor and I have talked about this Chinese influence by proxy, Confucius institutes and universities, infiltration into our education system, the cherry-picking of our best assets. Governments have been asleep at the wheel. Now we've got this raid on the Labor MP Mossel-Main in New South Wales, and the Mossel-Main raid is part of an unprecedented ASIO investigation into foreign interference by Chinese interests in this country. Catherine McGregor has made the point again, and she'll make it when I speak to her next week. She's made that point that, quote, we're on the edge of an abyss where the great liberal democratic project of the past 3 centuries may well be replaced by totalitarianism. Well, that brings us back to politicians and Mark Courret. My advice to Mr Courret is, and to all politicians, do some homework. Who are these United Front mob? Well, Chinese President Xi has described the United Front, which has infiltrated our political system here, as his magic weapon. Yet this mob are in our universities, in our corporations, and yes, in our political parties. Alex Josky from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has said, and I quote, United Front's work encompasses a broad spectrum of activity from espionage to foreign interference, influence and engagement. The Chinese Communist Party's attempts to interfere in diaspora, that is the communities around the world where homeland Chinese now live, the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to interfere in diaspora communities, influence political systems and covertly access valuable and sensible technology will only grow as tensions between China and countries around the world develop. And this brings the Andrews government into the picture again. It's been exposed as being heavily influenced by United Front operatives over many years, and it's being suggested that that influence reaches to the very top. The full extent of Chinese communist influence in the Australian political system is unknown, but it may well be that what we're learning today about Mark Courret and Mr Mossel-Main is the tip of the iceberg. I'm prepared to give the politicians the benefit of the doubt. I think they need to do some homework. Before we start taking political money from Chinese interests or even building up an association with them, we need to do some homework about who they are, where they're from and who they represent. Which brings us to our panel of women. Amanda Stoker, the Liberal Senator from Queensland, who belongs at the top of the tree, and Tanya Plibersek, the former Deputy Leader of the Labor Party and a very powerful figure in the alternative government. Tanya, could I come to you first because you've had experience in government. I mean, President Xi has described the United Front as his magic weapon. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute analysis suggests that they've spread into universities, corporations and political parties. Tanya, what needs to be done?
Well, there's 2 things I think we need to be careful of, Alan. The first is, as you said, politicians go to functions all the time. I've been to Chinese functions, I've been to Lebanese Maronite functions, Greek Orthodox functions in my electorate, Vietnamese, I've been to Jewish Hanukkah, I've been to, right across the board. And that's quite proper because we have new Australians, as my parents were called when they came here, who settle in Australia, who are great Australian patriots, but they want to share their culture. And that's a really great thing to be involved in. what you're talking about is something much more malevolent, which is the attempt of foreign governments to influence what happens here in Australia. It's not unique to Australia. There's more than one government trying to do it. In fact, the head of ASIO has said very clearly that there has not been a time in history where the efforts of foreign governments to infiltrate and influence Australian domestic politics has been as acute as it is now. And we have to defend against that. In 2018, Labor supported two pieces of legislation to try and push back on foreign interference. We refused to take donations from foreign sources years before the government legislated to prevent that. Just recently, we suggested an inquiry in the Senate to look at the use of social media in efforts to infiltrate and influence Australian domestic politics. We have to push back against all of it. And one last thing, Alan, you were sort of making implications about the Victorian government. I know Premier Andrews. He is an Australian patriot. He is a fine Australian patriot.
I'm worried about the Belt and Road stuff, Tanya, and I think the Belt and Road is an attempt for China to exert influence in a whole heap of countries. They're doing it right around the world. But look, I must go to Amanda. Amanda, if the fullest extent of Chinese communist influence in the Australian political system is unknown, how do we find out?
Well, I think the fact that we are having moments like discovering Aldi bags full of cash being delivered to Labor headquarters from people connected to the Chinese Communist Party, we know that Australia's intelligence agencies are doing their job. The first priority of the Australian government always has to be to keep Australians safe from those who would do them or the institutions on which they depend harm. And that's why the Morrison government has been committed to giving these agencies the powers and the resources and the police bodies that need to follow up with investigations and prosecutions what they need to be able to deliver for Australians.
Well, now, Tanya, if I come back to you, when Sharket Mosselmain says, and I quote, "As you are aware, the Australian Chinese community has been under sustained political, racial and physical abuse. They don't deserve the slander that they have received and certainly didn't deserve the abuse and violent political attacks they have so far sustained." Is that view... is entitled to the view, and we talk about free expression, he's entitled to say that. Does it suggest, though, that he might be doing someone else's bidding?
Well, the first thing to say is I thought Amanda might mention Gladys Liu, who is a Liberal Member of Parliament who has public links with the Communist Party.
That is absolutely right. That's quite right. Quite right.
And rather than trying to imply that this is somehow a Labor thing and a Liberal
No, I'm not suggesting that. No, I'm not suggesting that.
I know you're not. No. Amanda just did. And, Alan, what I would say is we need to work together. This should be above politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of us should be pushing away any attempt to influence our domestic politics by any outside influencer. Now, I'm not going to comment on the Sharket Mosselmain investigation. I wouldn't comment on any...
No, I was only using that as an example, Tanya.
Yes, but he's right in one sense. We do need to have robust political debates and people ought not be afraid to state their views in public. That's a really important part of our democracy that we need to protect. But always, always, Alan, we should be acting in the best interests of Australia. We should be putting Australia...
Absolutely. Well, just on that, if I come to Amanda, if the United Front, Amanda, is, as President Xi suggests, his magic weapon, shouldn't we start getting a wriggle on and finding out where they exist in universities, corporations and political parties?
Look, yes, but I think we can take some comfort from the fact that our intelligence agencies are uncovering problems of this kind more and more. That tells us that they have the powers they need to be doing their job of protecting Australians from those who don't have Australia's interests at heart. Now, I have to take the point, though, on Ms Liu. That is an entirely unfair comparison in circumstances where we have the Victorian government signing up to a program that is about delivering the Chinese Communist Party influence over governments here in Australia using their financial means, where we have former Labor senators who have had to resign over inappropriate connections to Communist Party influences, where we have had Aldi bags full of cash arriving, and now we have Mr Mosselmain raided for what appears to be an investigation into his staff and their inappropriate links. The comparisons could not be further from the truth. And the reason I raise them is that
Amanda,
to suggest that Labor's...
you might have missed You might have missed the reporting in New South Wales papers today about the $1,000 donation from the company that Alan mentioned to a Liberal Party MP.
I haven't missed that, Tanya, but the difference here is that you've come on the program and said that Labor are different because they outlawed donations. Well, that's all good and well, but when it's arriving in an Aldi bag, it suggests that I think whatever your policy might be, it isn't being borne out in real life.
Well, I think, Amanda and Tanya, isn't it true that when national security is involved, we've got to try and have an agreement between parties as to how it's going to be addressed? I mean, these are serious
100%.
threats. Serious threats, aren't they? Look, we'll leave it there. It's good to talk to you. I wanted to have a yarn with you tonight too, but we've run out of time on the budget, so store that along and we'll see actually how either of you thinks we're going to overcome the kind of budget problems we face. I think you'd both agree they're pretty significant, aren't they? OK, good to talk to you, Tanya.
Unemployment in particular.
A big issue.